I am here with Joanna Breyer, Dr. Joanna Breyer, who has written a book, When Your Child is Sick, a guide to navigating the practical and emotional challenges of caring for a child who is very ill. And I have read this book, and I have dog-eared this book, and I have some particular things I'm excited to talk to you about that are specific to this book, but also your career generally and your extraordinary perspective as someone who's worked with families of children who are seriously ill. So I'm really glad that we can be in conversation here. So I'm just going to get started. So Joanne, I need to remember Joanne now. We won't get that mess up. So I'm just going to quickly say this book is fabulously detailed with a lot of very specific, practical recommendations and suggestions for parents. Everything from coping techniques when there is pain and physical discomfort, tips for helping your children take medicine and medical interventions, decision making around medical interventions, having difficult conversations with your child, and all organized by the age of the child. One of the things we talk about is how when you get a devastating diagnosis for your child, whether it's terminal, as it was in my case, or cancer, at which point it's life-threatening and you don't know what the outcome will be, parents are thrust into this new land, this foreign land, this scary place, completely disoriented with no guide to lead them. There's not like a what to expect the way when you're having a child. And how have you thought about what parents sort of at a macro level, how would you describe what parents need as they begin this journey? If you were talking to a newly diagnosed, a family whose child had been newly diagnosed with cancer or another life-threatening condition, what would some of your first words of counsel be to them?
I think get to know the people in your new environment. And I think that's why, of whom there are enormous numbers of different people who will show up. Sort of get to know a little bit who they are, that they're people, and that they have different styles probably, but some of which you'll be more comfortable with than others. But that to get to know them, as well as the sort of the environment of the hospital. That is all going on at the same time they're trying to take care of what's going on at home as well. So it's a huge challenge. I would think other parents can be enormously helpful in that situation. And actually, one of the drawbacks of having a wonderful new hospital with rather a lot of individual rooms is that there's less obvious places for parents to get together and to talk and to learn from each other, which certainly, I've observed very, very much over the years. So using the resources, there is, resource specialists, social workers, psychologists who are on the, usually on the unit where you will be with your child, and sort of making use of them as well, because they will have, you will have your particular needs. They may be the people, or the nursing, or your primary nurse, who will be able to tell you what is available, what isn't available, where you can go, what you can do, and may actually be helpful in getting it for you. So it's sort of orienting, finding out who's around and what's around, and how to make the best use of them that works for you.
What about for the families for whom, at least for the beginning, it's not going to be a highly medicalized process? Like, certainly with cancer, and I appreciate, it's important to note that your primary background has been in oncology and transplant. But for families for whom it's not about hospitalization, or at least not typically, it sort of take it up a notch where it's not just about the medical care of the child, but the whole psychosocial realm that is suddenly really threatened when your child could die? What do you say to families? What would you sort of have families think about on that psychosocial level?
I would say that could depend. I mean, an awful lot of my book says it depends.
Yes.
So what I'm saying now is
Yes.
going to be it depends.
Yes.
But on the age of the child, how physically affected they are, because some conditions, they may not be that affected they immediately, that they may continue to be able to go to school. And in a situation where it's possible, I would hope that the parents would consider how they could continue to have as normal a life as the family possibly can have under the circumstances, which might include, the child continuing to go to school, having friends over in the way that they had been, keeping the friends that they had. So in some ways, keeping life as normal as it can be, while at another level, most likely, particularly for the parents, not necessarily for the child, considering planning, depending on who the parents are, how things will be as the child's condition gets worse.
And what would you say about the role of psychotherapy and psychosocial support? We can get a little more deeper into it in terms of, you talk very eloquently towards the end about, indicators that you really need help. Like what are the red signs. But just before there are even red signs, sort of in the opportunity, encouragement, or invitation to maybe get a little help so you don't feel like you have to cope all by yourself.
I would say that probably would be, particularly if the diagnosis down the road is likely to be terminal, and that the child is likely to die, to get an outside person involved, a therapist, who is experienced in that area. Because very often parents do have different styles of dealing with a particular awful situation, and they need to observe their own styles and the styles of the person who they're living with, because it may be different, and that may be really annoying to one of the people. And also it will feel more of a personal affront than it's intended to be, as opposed to a life-saving device for the other person. So the more that can be understood, and it may be very difficult to notice that on one's own, and certainly a therapist would be very able to help you notice.
We talk about the giving providers the opportunity that parents have to give providers permission to talk about their child's prognosis with them. So, because I know sometimes doctors and nurses and social workers may be reluctant because they think the parent can't handle it or doesn't want to talk about it, or the child can't handle it or doesn't want to talk about it, and that parents can, if they're up for it, can prompt the provider to go there with them by giving them an invitation, giving them permission. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you've seen and how you think about that permission? Do you frame it even like that?
I haven't thought about it precisely like that. There's certainly, I think what you would talk about, what you would mean by permission would be if the parent asked, is my child going to make it? Or something that brought the subject into the conversation. Or, I'm really worried, should I be? Even something like that is I would see as an opening for the provider to go into more details about what the child's prognosis is likely to be. So, yes, I can imagine that, and I think absolutely I would encourage parents to do that if they do want to hear. I think a situation I've also seen is when a parent makes it quite obvious that they don't want to hear it. And in a way, more of a challenge for the provider is how to handle that. And I think that parents do have very different ways, but complicated ways of processing awful news. And I remember one parent who said to me, I think Dr. So-and-so doesn't understand, I understand. She said, I only need to be told once that my child is going to die. I don't need to be told many times. And what was happening, which I sort of realized, was that because she was giving the message she didn't want to talk about it, the doctor was feeling that she didn't understand and so felt he had to keep on repeating it. And she found that pretty painful. But I said, perhaps you could tell him that. And I'm not sure whether she did or not, but the dilemma can come up in many different forms. And I also have observed very much that a parent can appear to acknowledge it at one moment and then appear to be thinking of something else, the child going back to college or something that may not be realistic at all. But it's sort of how I always would see that was as a way that the parent had of almost allowing herself to continue to be with her child in the way that she wanted to be. And it's not the same as denial, because it would go back and forth. Sometimes it could be denial, and that is more problematic. I mean, and I also had parents say to me, well, the doctor kept telling me that he was going to die. I just didn't believe them afterwards. So I do think there is a range of reactions, and that the obvious reaction, the surface reaction may not really be what is going on. So to be a little bit careful about how far you push when you're not quite sure what's behind it.
Yeah. You were talking about how parents can compartmentalize, the different responses parents can have to a life-threatening diagnosis for their child. And one of the ones you said is, you only need to be told only once that your child is going to die. It's not something that you forget. Another one that you say is parents, I don't want to be so sad that I cannot enjoy whatever time I have left with him. I'm not going to grieve for 1 second longer than I have to before I have to. So that might also be something that the parent's doing. Another thing you've heard parents say is, once I start crying, I'm afraid I won't be able to stop. That's a parent reaction. I didn't have that one, but I can relate to it myself. This one, which you said, the doctors kept telling me he was going to die. I just did not believe them. I don't know why. What happens to that parent who doesn't believe that their child is going to die?
That is a parent who can have a very, very hard time and who I would worry about. It is such a shock if they have really barricaded their mind to force themselves not to believe what they have been told, perhaps repeatedly. That can be a very worrying situation, and that parent may well need professional help. But I have also seen parents who have, on the surface, appeared not to believe that their child is going to die, and who have said things like, "God will not let my child die." Then, when the child does die, then say to themselves, "It was God's will." That my child was going to die, and perhaps there's a purpose to it. So, and you don't know in advance, you don't know what reaction that parent is going to have. Maybe they will find some things afterwards that will comfort themselves. I had another parent who did appear to be denying that her child was going to die. And then when she did die, appeared to be coping, was obviously incredibly upset, but not more than most parents would be. And she said to me about a month later, not saying why she didn't believe that her child was going to die, or that she hadn't, but that she said, what I couldn't have stood was my daughter being afraid. Mm-hmm. And she thought that if her daughter had any idea that she was going to die, that she would have been afraid. Mm. And she didn't want her to be. And that was the sort of... I think that then she was able to think to herself, my daughter died unafraid. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that was a comfort.
So during her daughter's lifetime, by not actively thinking that her child could die, this mother felt that she was protecting her child from being afraid of the possibility that she could die, and that she had successfully helped her daughter not have fear, and that's how she processed it.
Yes, but this mother also, closer to the time that her daughter was dying, was actually beginning to reconnect with other parents whose child had died. Mm-hmm. And she'd say, well, I just talked to so-and-so. So in a way, she was indirectly mm-hmm. preparing herself. Mm-hmm. But not in any very obvious way. I mean, I suppose that is fairly obvious, but not in any direct way.
This really stood out with me. You wrote that to a parent, you may worry that you are giving up by acknowledging your child's prognosis, but acknowledging is very different than giving up. This notion of, again, acknowledgement versus hope. Like acknowledging something isn't the same as giving up that it will be other. I don't know. This isn't a question. I'm just mm-hmm. I just love that. Acknowledging your child's prognosis is very different than giving up on the possibility that your child could get well. If there is that possibility that your child could get well. That goes into that prognosis piece.
And the hope piece.
How have you professionally over the years and personally come to think about the role of hope and how to talk to families about hope and children about hope, and even how to think about hope for yourself? It's a big question.
I think a wonderful adolescent who had, through no fault of his own, basically had just received a death sentence. And what he said to me was, I guess I must hope for one thing and prepare for another. And in a way, I think that hope is often what comforts people in a very difficult situation. It also, I think what I talked a lot to parents about was that sometimes hope changes, and that what you hope for may change as a child's illness progresses. And that to begin with, you're hoping for cure. Perhaps you will begin to hope for other things, whether it be that your child be at home, whether it be that your child does attend their graduation, go to a relative's wedding, whatever the hope may be, that I suppose I'm slightly in favour of realistic hopes, because that you are less likely to be deeply disappointed when they don't occur. But it certainly worries me, because hope may help somebody keep going, but it may not be achievable, which is, I think, what you're saying, and worrying about, and whether it will become such a strong belief. And I suppose it depends how much the hope is actually a belief, depending on whether it has what kind of effect it has on a parent. And I think that what you sound as if you might be worrying about is that when they have a scientist talking about rational hope for a cure for a very so far incurable disease, obviously every parent whose child has that disease is going to start hoping that their child is going to be the number one survivor of this particular condition. And I suppose it depends how strongly that turns into a belief rather than a hope.
Oh, I love that, the distinction between hope and belief. I have not heard that before, but there's a big difference. Wow, so if you believe your child is going to qualify for the trial and be treated, and then doesn't, how devastating that is, as opposed to when it's just a hope, but when it's a hope, it leaves the possibility that it won't happen. Oh, I love that. It's a very subtle but critical distinction. I do a lot of our families, Courageous Parents Network families, and certainly my own family have a relationship with rare diseases for which there historically haven't been treatments, and now with the advances in science, my goodness, thank goodness, and gene therapy and all these other things, the opportunities for experimental trials and therapies are increasing. But with that comes all the complexity of hope, expectation, in some instances belief. And I do worry a lot about that there's going to be this new field of support that families are going to need, that in the past it was all about it was only palliative medicine because there was no treatment or therapy, such as in our case. And now suddenly it's going to be about balancing hope versus...
Now uncertainty is reaching into which, if you think about it, cancer, leukemia used to be in that situation.
Yeah.
And it was a death sentence.
Yeah.
Even for a child. And gradually it wasn't.
Yeah.
But then the uncertainty appears. And you don't quite know. So you're handling uncertainty as opposed to a more certain, if tremendously sad, reality. I suppose acknowledging it and acknowledging how difficult it is being in an uncertain place. That, and particularly there are some people who have particularly difficult times living with uncertainty, who are used to maybe in their lives being able to make decisions, have things happen, as opposed to the ones who maybe a little bit more fatalistic and say we will try, we will hope, but we obviously don't know. So I think acknowledging that it's difficult, acknowledging we wish we could know but we can't.
How do you accompany a parent going through that, which it would be particularly true for transplant or chemotherapy, which really these are interventions that make our children so sick in order to hopefully make them better?
Particularly a transplant, depending on what the statistics are for this particular kind of transplant. There are some kinds of transplant that have a very good chance of survival and minimum side effects, and there is, or not too huge side effects, and there are, but with uncertainty. But there are others that have a very, very low probability of success, but still may be offered by the particular hospital. I would try to get them to think about if they could balance, if there were, maybe there wouldn't be awful side effects, but if there were, how would you feel about that? Which maybe your child could die from. How would you feel about it? And if it's a transplant that has a low, 20% chance of success, something like that, and it could be that this doesn't sound as if it's got a good chance of working. It's got some chance, but pretty little chance. How are you going to feel taking that route versus trying to provide as much comfort and doing whatever things that you want, and being more in control of the way your child dies than you might be in this other situation? I suppose I would try to get, or did try to get, a parent to balance those kinds of considerations.
And using hypothetical language, like if.
How would you then think about when you look back? That's quite a challenge to do that, and some parents wouldn't want to do that anyway. So, but with some parents, that might be a route to,
I think,
help them think about it.
What would you have parents think about when the sibling is the donor? Or consider when the sibling may be the donor, is likely to be the donor?
Well, we did have a rule at Dana-Farber, which was that any child who was 4 years old or older would meet with the psychologist before before the process went ahead that they would be the donor. And it was to be sure that they understood what they were being asked to do and what they weren't being asked to do. And that means that they were being asked to give some stem cells, and they were not being asked to save their brother or sister's life. And that they understood, and that was really the limits of what they were being asked to do. And that they knew what the process was that they were going to go through. So it was both giving practical information and checking out that they didn't have too high expectations, that they would then be blaming themselves if things went wrong. And which they could do. Right? This transplant is a complicated and sometimes dangerous procedure, but getting better and better all the time, but still with statistics. You want to remember the ones that are not so great. And because quite often the situation would be when the child came to meet with us that the parents might have done one of three things. One, they might have told the child that presented it in such a way that the child was feeling that it was necessary for them to do it to save their brother or sister's life, and i.e. they had no choice whatsoever. The other extreme would be that actually there'd been very little discussion about how serious the brother or sister's condition was. And this was just sort of something that they were expected to do. And then there'd be the middle of the road where, yes, they were being asked to do this, and it was important, and the hope was that they would do it. So what we would try to do in the interview was see that they knew what the actual medical things that they were being asked to do were, which in our case was that they would be come into the hospital, get anesthesia, have some stem cells taken out of their back, and they'd wake up with probably an IV, and that their back might be sore for about a week, and they wouldn't do contact sports if they were old enough for a while. But then the more important part, in a way, was what their expectation was about why they were doing it and why they needed to do it. And there, actually, there's for slightly younger children, there's a marvelous book, which is like sowing seeds in a garden, that we wanted to get across the idea that what they were doing was like giving a gift to their brother or sister, and that what then happened after the gift was given, which is the stem cells, it's then up to the soil, the rain. Every child from the age of 4 on can answer the question, well, what does a seed need to grow? Well, it needs sun, it needs rain, it's right soil. So that it's like that you have given the gift of the seed. And then after that, it's up to the doctors, your brother or sister's body, the medications, all of which are necessary to work together to have this turn into, for the seeds to grow in the way, in this instance, that the doctors hope that they will. So you have done all you can by giving this gift, and that after that, it is up to everybody else and not at all up to you what happens. And then if it was a pretty risky transplant, we would a little bit more, and we would ask, and what do you think would happen if you didn't give that? Or why does your brother or sister need these cells? And most of them would have a pretty good idea, and some of them would say, well, if he didn't get them, he'd die. So I would tend to say, well, he needs this for his illness to be cured. This is giving him the best chance that he has of getting through this illness. Therefore, you are you're giving this gift, you are contributing, but that's the end. So do you understand that if anything does not go right, that it has nothing to do with you? And almost always from children of 4 onwards would say, yes, we do understand.
Can we talk a little bit about what happens when it is the parent's only child who is seriously ill, and the parents are having to make decisions for their child around that? And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I had a conversation with a mother not too long ago whose daughter has a heart condition, very rare and life-threatening, very life-threatening heart condition, and is now, I don't know how old she is, maybe 7. And the mother knows that the possibility of that transplant is in her daughter's future, but it is not necessarily the best. It will likely be the only thing they could do, but isn't necessarily the best thing they can do. One of the options is to transition just to palliative care at that point. They're not there yet, but she's imagining having to make the decision, transplant or no transplant. And what this mother said to me was, I'm really worried that I'm going to make a decision because I'm afraid of being alone without her, as opposed to because I know it's in her best interest. And I was so moved by this mother's self-awareness and her honesty, and also that quandary.
A horrible situation. And it sounds as if that particular mother is sufficiently self-aware and thoughtful that probably will make a decision that she will be able to look back on and think, I really think she will not regret the decision that she took. But it certainly is the situation where a child dies who is the only child is a pretty awful situation. I mean, so is every other situation, because it just has such consequences for the role that the parents move from, which is being parents to no longer being parents, as opposed to continuing to be parents for the children who are left. And I don't know what the literature says about this, but it would seem to me that the challenge for the parents is to find a way both to remember their child, but to continue being in the world in a way that makes sense to both of them. And whether it is, and also it's a challenge to the relationship, because they were joint parents, and now they have to go back to grieving in their own ways and yet continuing to be a pair, and how they do that, and without not exactly the distraction, but without the focus of having another child or several children there to be with. So sort of the spotlight is more glaring in a way, and how each parent works it out will determine whether they can continue to make a go of it together or whether they don't.
One of your areas of expertise is working with the children themselves, and not just the parents, but working with the children. And you really know children. And I think for some percentage of the Courageous Parents Network population, their children have cognitive impairment or are so young that they're not going to be having conversations with their children. But there's a large population for whom that is not true, that their children do know what's going on or may know what's going on, and these are parents wondering how to talk with their children, what to say, what can their children handle. Your book has so much practical advice for how language to use, opportunities for having conversations, like in the car, on a hike, finding when your children like to connect. So the book has a lot of detail, but in this conversation right now, what would you have parents understand just generally about going there with your child around the difficult things, around what children can handle about knowing that they have a serious condition? And as things shift, and maybe they're not getting better, and end of life is something that is more likely, then how to transition the conversation to that. Giving parents the confidence to have the conversation, permission to have the conversation, bandwidth to not have the conversation, I don't know. How would you say it?
I would say that a parent needs to probably have not exactly have come to terms, but at least to have acknowledged in his or her own heart that her child is not likely to live. To have, and therefore, for at least some parents, it may not be too far from the time that their child does die, because they haven't acknowledged it to themselves up until that point. With other parents, and it depends so much on the child, and it depends what the child is asking, and also what is behind what the child is asking. A child saying at the beginning of treatment of where they have a perfectly good prognosis, am I going to die? Because they hear that they have at some level know that people with cancer, particularly adults, do sometimes die, is a very different question. And but asking, well, what's leading you to ask that, or what's behind that question? Probably you will get more information. You know what question you're really dealing with, which may be, well, I've heard that people with cancer do die, so am I going to? And at that point, you're honestly likely to be able to say, well, most children who have the kind of cancer you have get treatment and actually do very well. And we certainly hope that that's going to be the case with you. We'll, if ever you're worrying, ask us some more, and we'll tell you. And that's at a very different, that's a very different situation from when a child down the road, when they have relapsed, and they're getting experimental treatment, but still that could work. It's a different question, and may require a somewhat different answer. Again, with, we're trying some new medicine, and we're very much hoping that it works. We will keep you, we'll keep you posted. Always ask us if you have concerns. And then, so sort of, you're being honest, but you're not emphasizing the fact that they could die. And if the child asks more, and depending on the age, an adolescent probably has a very good idea of what the reality could be, and then that may require a rather different conversation. But it's sort of giving openings, trying to understand where the child is, what they're ready to. And it's, that's where a hypothetical is. If you were to get, do you want to know? I remember a conversation that and it's trying to find out, being able to have conversations at any time when the opening comes up. It's not a single conversation. It's sort of being aware and attuned to the questions that a child is bringing up at any point in their treatment. And I was thinking of a situation where a child had actually had relapsed herself, was going to need a transplant. And we felt her parents had not told her that a child she'd known very well had died. And we thought that when she was going into the hospital again, she was going to find out, so she needed to be told. So she was told that, and she was very upset, and she decided what she was going to do. She came to my office, and we wrote a letter to the parents of the child. And then she wanted to know if she was going to die, and she was going to have it. It was a transplant that had a reasonable chance of success, but it had a reasonable chance of failure too. So it was so I took the opportunity of saying to her, so I said, well, we hope that, it does, people are often do get better for having had this transplant. And we hope that will be the case with you. And there was a film that, at that point, Dana-Farber had films that you showed children before they went in transplant. The first question she wanted to ask about the children shown in the films were, are they alive? Mm-hmm. And luckily, both of them had survived, so we could truthfully say, yes, they were. Mm-hmm. But what I then asked her was, and she said, well, if I'm going to die, I don't want to know. Having just been asking me all this. And I said, are you sure? Because, how will you know? If we can't tell you what the truth is, how are you going to know when to believe us or not? Mm. And she paused and she thought, well, that's true. She said, I think I do want to know. Mm-hmm. And then, in fact, she actually went on ahead and did very, very well. But if she had not done well, I would have taken us back to that conversation, because I wouldn't have assumed that what she said then was necessarily what she would want at the time she really had got worse. So I would sort of be feeling out. I said, remember that conversation we had just before? What are you thinking about that right now? She would perfectly well realize what I was saying, that she probably had got worse because she was a highly intelligent child. But it would have that was asking for permission. I would have wanted to, since she was obviously a little ambivalent, I would want to know where her position was as things had got worse.
Parents sometimes don't talk to their children about what's happening because they think that they need to protect their child from the possibility that they could die, or the fact that they are dying in that moment, or that the treatments aren't working and now they're dying. Whereas the research indicates that children do typically know and are thinking it's their job to protect their parents from the hurtful conversation. So we're not going to have me doing this. Can you talk a little bit about what you believe and have learned about how the children's dynamic with their parents, not so much the parents' dynamic with their child, but the children who are old enough to be in control of how they interact with their parents around serious illness?
I mean, I do think it depends very much on the comfort level of the parent having these conversations, how prepared the child is to have them. I mean, I do remember one situation where I think that they were not. This was a child who had a very bad prognosis, and parents were separated, and the child was clearly talking about what heaven was like, or what, and with both of her parents separately, who did not get on. And to one parent wouldn't talk about it, and would basically say, well, we don't have to think about that. We don't. And so there, with one parent, the avenue of talking was shut down. With the other parent, was much more prepared to think about what heaven was like, to fantasize about it. And the child said to that parent, I like your answer better than I liked the other parent, which sort of gave that parent that it was okay to have these conversations. And they weren't saying that the child was dying, but it was clearly the child was thinking, the child was moving in that direction, and was really saying, and I want to be able to talk about it. So I remember saying to another parent, because she was saying, I couldn't possibly talk about, it was a child with a brain tumor who was going to die. And I just said, well, I think you will know when you feel it's the right moment. And she told me later that actually one night when he was having a bath, and they did begin to talk about it. It is sort of, I saw it more as a process, and that it's a process that the parent needs to come along to a certain point before they can begin to even think about having a conversation. And and sometimes, in my example, even adolescents have very different ways that they choose to die, and whom they choose to talk about it with, and who they don't. And sometimes they choose not to talk about it with anybody. And that's sometimes who they are, and that's how they want it to be. So I think I'm a respecter of different routes, and not a deep believer that there's only one.
I love what you said about how you told this mom, you're going to know if and when the moment is right. You will know. And that's this notion of confidence is really important to what Courageous Parents Network is trying to do, is give parents the confidence that they will be able to do this, and that they will know what to do when the moment comes. And that's a great that's a great example, because no parent can imagine that they could possibly talk to their child about their child's end of life. Like that's a crazy making. Like that's an impossible thing. So the default is going to be never in a million years. That's like out of a nightmare. That's not even
right.
But in fact, if it is part of your reality, you will be able to do it. It's a little bit of just trust me. You will be able to do this. Trust yourself. Actually, trust yourself.
But that if it doesn't happen, or it may happen in other ways. I mean, it may happen in indirect ways. It may happen in, but that if they've thought about it and they are trying to prepare themselves, I would agree with you that they will feel what is right for them at that moment.
Can you name or just talk a little bit about some indicators that parents should be looking for that the surviving siblings may be struggling and need some extra support?
Um, well, I would actually say that a sibling who's had a brother or sister die is very likely both to benefit from and to, if there's any possible way that they can go to a group or not necessarily immediately, but at some point, I think that, I suppose, the obvious answer to that is if they seem, if there's obvious changes in behavior, if they're obviously anxious, they don't want to go to school, they're depressed, they won't talk about the brother or sister who didn't. I mean, there were obvious warning signs, but for any brother or sister who has had a brother or sister die, I mean, it's a huge, huge, huge deal. And whether they are, holding themselves up to be supporting the parents, and they maybe appear to be the perfect children who are doing everything the way that the parents hope, to have a place where they don't need to worry about their parents, to be with other brothers and sisters. I mean, they're likely to feel alone, they're likely to feel they're the only people in the world to whom this has happened. Do they have to be, will they ever be able to be the person who their brother or sister was? I mean, there are just many, 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 and their whole, their parents are perfectly miserable. They may or may not be getting the attention that they hoped for. So that there are so many things going on and also the parents are grieving. So they perhaps were not the way they were with that child, and who can blame them? But therefore, for the brothers and sisters to have a place to go where other siblings have experienced a similar loss is so important and so valuable. If there's any sort of, and there are programs that have groups for siblings, and it's one of the, I think it's one of the bereavement interventions, which is more ambiguous about the findings, and more ambiguous for parents going into support groups, because for some people it's wonderful and for some people it's not. But that the evidence that I am aware of for siblings is that it's very, very helpful. So I would encourage any parent to find out whether and even if it's only for a day, we would sometimes do just a day that siblings who had lost a brother or sister would come in, and we would have a group, sort of age, broken down by ages roughly. And I think that, that they would say at the end, it's just so wonderful to feel we're not alone. And they would share some of their reaction. I mean, one of the most moving groups I've ever been part of. So I thoroughly, completely advocate for finding out a group for siblings. And if not immediately, 6 months or so after. Or if they don't want to go then, just to have them exposed to it, that there are other children who have had the same experience. Not the same, but has had a similar experience of major, major loss in the family.
Psychotherapists and become very close to families when they're working with them and with the child, and then at some point the professional relationship ends because either the child is better or the child has died. What happens to the relationship after? Like, what would you want parents to understand about the continuing or discontinuing relationship with the key people in their child's care team?
Well, I hope that my book has shown at least some of the parents what an enormous amount they meant to me, and how much they have remained in my mind and in my memory. And certainly talking with many of them when I was writing this book was rather wonderful, in the sense that first they were universally the ones who I reached. were enthusiastic about me doing this book, and also willing to have their stories told, and sort of very encouraging. And so and also it was a wonderful benefit for me to hear about what was happening in their lives, and to, some of whom I had already remained in contact with. But I also understand that for some people, particularly when a child has died, that however close you are to the caregivers who were with you at that time, whatever your feelings about them may be, that in some ways you don't want to have anything to do with them anymore, because it is so associated with the most painful time you can possibly imagine. And for some people, therefore, either they do not want to have contact with those people who were associated with this awful thing happening. The proceeds from my book will go to the Dana-Farber's global health initiatives, which I wanted to find a good related cause, and the statistics are so awful that it wasn't very difficult. That 200,000 children a year, apparently, are diagnosed with cancer throughout the world. 20% of those are in high-income countries. Of those children, approximately 80% survive. In medium-income and low-income countries, the other 80% are diagnosed. Of those, only 20% approximately survive. So it wasn't very difficult to figure out that this was a very good related cause. And Dana-Farber has different projects in different countries, some of which are connected to psychosocial programs and interventions, which also are very important in helping reduce this huge and awful discrepancy. So it is to those that any proceeds from this book will go.